The 1930s and 40s were a heyday for Freemasonry in Washington, D.C., with both Franklin D. Roosevelt and Harry S. Truman being 33rd degree Scottish Rite Masons. John Fetzer spent extensive periods of time in D.C. during these 2 decades. In the 30s, lobbying for a 24-hour radio license for himself, and by extension for other small-town station owners, and in the mid-1940s as head of the Department of Censorship for radio. And in 1934, John also became a Freemason, by 1936 attaining the 32nd degree. We in the Fetzer Memorial Trust came to surmise that John's Masonic activities in this area intersected with and informed his political efforts. And so we took the opportunity with former Masonic Grand Master Akram Elias to discuss this notion in detail, both in a sit-down interview in Kalamazoo in April 2016, and also in walking interviews with Akram in December 2015 in D.C., at the FDR Memorial and in front of the White House. We're back here in Kalamazoo again for this topic of our interview with Akram Elias, former Grand Master of the Washington, D.C. Masonic Lodge. We're in the boardroom downstairs at the Fetzer Institute. We have the bottom half of the round Jeffersonian window here. And also with us again is Brian Wilson, Western Michigan University professor. So our first question is this. How beneficial was it for someone like John Fetzer to become a Mason in Washington, D.C. at this time, since John was lobbying on the Hill and in the FCC? If it was beneficial to him on the Hill, in what way was it a benefit? Please talk about how that network of Masons on the Hill and in the White House worked and or still works in D.C.
Well, the 30s were an incredible period in Washington, D.C. as far as Freemasonry. First, let me give you some context. If one were to take the census, 1930 census, for example, of the population of Washington, D.C., it was approximately 480,000 people at the time. When it came to the only members of the Grand Lodge of Washington, D.C., or the District of Columbia, there were over 20,000. You're talking just under 5% of the population of the district were members of Freemasonry. This is huge when you think about that. So the 30s were still part of that golden age. Golden age meaning Freemasonry was very well present, not only in the District of Columbia, but across the country. And pillars of the community, commissioners, people working in the government, in the federal government, working in business, etc. Freemasonry was everywhere. So the atmosphere in Washington, D.C. was, given how small it is, was quite intimate. People would fraternize, would socialize. The Mayflower Hotel was a place, the Statler, I think it was called, the Willard Hotel now, or the Washington Hotel. Names have changed over time. These were places where Masons would typically go to have a drink together or maybe have a cigar together at that time. Smoking was a different place. So pretty much like social networks, existed, or people from Greek fraternities, would meet, or alumni, from universities. In a way, Freemasonry was bigger, and definitely people knew one another. People would wear wear like either rings or symbols of Freemasonry to recognize one another, and that did not guarantee anything except a good ear. In other words, I'd listen to you. You're my brother. You have something to say. I don't have to say anything. I will listen more carefully to you. There's nothing guaranteed. I'm still going to do whatever I think would be the right thing if I'm voting on something, but it's definitely you're going to get a good ear. So that opens the environment, that breaks the ice. It creates a more friendly atmosphere. Imagine people meeting to discuss some transaction, not knowing one another. Every side comes into the table, thinking, okay, what's the other side want? How do I? And now if somehow there is a bond where people connect beyond this transaction at a different level, you automatically have a much more relaxed atmosphere. I have a feeling that you're going to level with me. So when I'm asking you questions, you're going to really level with me, and vice versa. So it was incredible. And so the presence was incredible over the fraternity. The atmosphere they're constantly meeting, in different formats, getting to know one another, and there's no question about the assistance by providing that ear. It's very important.
Good, thank you. Yeah. Mr. Fetzer was also particularly aided at that time in D.C. by 8 other prominent politicians there. 5 of the 8 were Masons. 4 senators, including Harry Truman at the time. Both senators from Michigan, Arthur Vandenberg, and also Prentice Brown. Vandenberg was a Republican, Prentice Brown a Democrat. You had the son of FDR, was an ally of John Fetzer's as well. So our next question really is just a follow-up on the first question, which is, talk about FDR as a Mason during his presidency. How active was he as a Mason? How public was he about being a Mason? There's a story about him promoting Masonry while he was president down in Warm Springs, Georgia. There's a photograph of him putting on more or less a public, some kind of public presentation for Freemasons in Warm Springs, Georgia. There's a photograph of him doing that. Also his cabinet and his kitchen cabinet. Vice Presidents Henry Wallace and Harry Truman, of course. The Supreme Court was supposedly about half Freemasons at the time. So my question sort of is this Democratic presence in D.C. at the time, and FDR and his allies being Freemasons. What was that like politically? What was the Freemason presence in D.C. like? So it doesn't necessarily apply to John Fetzer particularly, but just generally, how influential were the Freemasons on the Hill and in the White House at the time?
What influence did that have on bipartisanship at the time?
Yeah, that's a follow-up for me. It doesn't seem to be primarily Republican or Democrat, at least in John's case. There were Republicans as well as Democrats. So was it primarily Democrat, do you think, or was it both sides?
Freemasonry has always had, members from both political parties, libertarians, conservative, Democrats, Republicans. It's because the idea, again, of people coming from different persuasions, whether religious or political persuasions. The idea is that the lodge would be the place where they can learn to respect one another, create certain bonds that hopefully will translate to bettering communities, hopefully bring civility to the debate, hopefully do this, do that. Well, FDR met on regular basis with Freemasons while he was in the White House. There were Masons invited to the White House. Masons organized once a year a major conference. In those days, it was held always in Washington. So automatically there was something with the White House, a message either from the White House or a visit to the White House. And if you look at proceedings of meetings of the Freemasons at that time, how could we help the war effort? Masons were engaged heavily in supporting FDR's call to, we're talking about war bonds, So while the institution itself doesn't take any position, the leaders of Freemasonry were encouraging the members, this is a call to the great experiment, and we need to help support it. Social Security Act, what does it mean? How can the fraternity deal with it? How does it impact also our institutions? So there was a lot of today you have at the level of our government, you have these open hearings, the executive branch creates task forces, committees, so you get input, partnership between civil society, and government in the area of governance, which is very healthy for to sustain a democratic republic. Well, in those days, those things happened, but in different ways. 2016 is different from 1930. So those informal networks to get input, especially you're talking about a fraternity that was very well established across the 50 states with pillars of the community in business, in government, in clergy across the country. So listening to that network of people and what their concerns were as individuals, as citizens, and at the same time, always the idea, how can we help? For example, after World War I, before we got into World War II, so right in the 30s, before the United States really got into the war, we didn't get into war really till 1941, when Japan hit the United States on December 7. But before that, we were still dealing with World War I. So you can see in the proceedings of Freemasons, how can the Grand Lodges, and when they met always in Washington, and the reports of how can we support Washington, D.C., for example, major offer by the Freemasons of Washington, D.C. for all veterans who had come back from World War I, who were going through still problems, the beginning of the Depression hit. How do you offer home, relief, support to our veterans? And the difficult times they're going through now with the beginning of the Depression, although the war was over. So these things were happening all the time, and it had nothing to do with partisanship. The idea was we're a society of brothers, so we need to come together as a community to help. In this case, we're helping America, we're helping Americans. These were difficult times, and Grand Lodges had to step up to the challenge, irrespective of partisanship. So given their presence in their communities, the White House was listening. In the case later on with Truman, it intensified, further intensified, because there are a lot of things that were happening in the country. In Washington specifically, Truman engaged even more forcefully than FDR, and we could see that from the minutes from the proceedings. And the aim was always, how can you, if you're a Freemason, you're a builder and you're free, how can we advance this community of freedom? And obviously, with Truman specifically, the challenge became, how do we it became global. So you could start looking at the proceedings, and we were talking about the status, what is happening in Europe? what is happening around the world. The United States being FDR said this is supposed to be the arsenal of democracy under Truman. Don't forget the whole national security establishment was really done. And no question, members of the fraternity Republicans and Democrats, came together for this because the United States had to step up as we saw the threat of extremist ideologies, done with Nazism. Now you have communism coming. How do we secure? So it is no coincidence that in 1947, the National Security Act was passed. And under Truman's leadership, the various institutions, the National Security Council, Central Intelligence Agency, etc., this infrastructure was set up to help the United States strengthen the axis of freedom across the Atlantic, come to the defense of Europe, and defend basically this concept of democratic republicanism, which was being besieged at the time. And as a Freemason, it doesn't take much
big
selling.
Issue. Yeah,
Of course, it's a big issue.
Yeah.
Fighting any form of extremism. So, obviously, FDR fighting fear, coming together, Truman coming in the defense of this whole experiment. It doesn't take much to move a Mason. So you have basically people who are ready to help out one way or another and rally for the cause, to the cause.
Could you point to any particular legislation or government action at that time that you would say was inspired by Masonic philosophy?
I can't think right now of any specific legislation, but definitely the concept of protecting freedom was essential, was a driving force. So for Masons, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, how do you rally around that, crafted, and keep in mind, when we talk about freedom, we're talking about enlightened freedom. In other words, how do you set up legislation, create infrastructure to protect ourselves physically and protect freedom physically, but at the same time without undermining the key principles and foundation of enlightened freedom enshrined in the Constitution of the United States that the Founding Fathers played a role in. So how do you create that balance? It's been, it's still the challenge, and we face it today in this new world since 9/11. How do you create that balance? Strike it. It's not easy.
You had mentioned before that FDR's For Freedom speech seemed to have a strong Masonic overtone, so I wonder if you can address that here for a couple minutes.
When, there's obviously the obvious freedoms that, whether it's freedom of speech or freedom of the press, this is the one dimension of freedom that every American citizen understands and resonates with us. What is important is to remember the other side of freedom, without which that freedom of speech and freedom of the press will go so far. And that is, we have to be free from. And when he speaks about freedom from fear, fear in and of itself is important. In what respect? It sends a signal, because prudence, and a Mason is taught prudence. Prudence is one of the important elements that a Mason has to take into account as he or she's maneuvering in their environment. If you're not prudent, you become reckless. So fear is like pain in your body, a signal. It tells you, watch out, there's something.
Out of balance.
Out of balance. But we need to be free from fear, because we should never allow fear to take hold of us, to control us. So it has to be used and understood as something to alert us but not let it take over and drive us. So we need to free ourselves from fear. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to think outside of a box that we typically as humans lock ourselves in. Humans create their own box. There is no box. We lock ourselves. We put the walls. We create the boundaries, and we lock ourselves in. And fear is, whenever we let fear take over us, we need the walls, because now we're prisoners. So we need to protect ourselves, and we can't. That's it. We're prisoners, period. But it's our doing. No one is causing it. So we need to be free from fear, free from want. It's something he talked about, which is important. Want here has two meanings, and think always duality here. There's the want, the basic. You have a depression, and 25% of Americans, fell into severe poverty, or 1/3 fell into severe, about 25% unemployed, etc. No human being should be at a level of misery. So there is a minimum of need that must be satisfied, and that's the first aspect of freedom from want, which I call the exoteric. But the esoteric, freedom from want, is a greed. The more we want, the less free we become. And how, as an individual, you find your point of equilibrium. Get what you really need as a necessity, because as a human being, you need to have that. But then not be driven by that want. I want more toys, more stuff, more money, more, for what? So if we're not free from that, we're no longer free. We lose control. So that's going back, connecting it to the Masonic concept of freedom.
Our last question on this topic. By the end of the war, by 44-45, Mr. Fetzer was appointed head of censorship for radio. And then by this time, of course, Harry Truman was president. And Truman was also, as you've mentioned, a Freemason. I think he was the Grand Master of the Masonic Lodge of Missouri. Correct. So my question here is, would you like to say anything about Masonic influence during the Truman administration? Would you think Mr. Fetzer, being a Mason, may have helped him get this post as head of censorship for radio? And then finally, after the war, Mr. Fetzer successfully pushed to have the Department of Censorship shut down. And he was very proud of saying to me several times, is that the only time in the history of the United States that a federal department had been closed down, and that he pushed very strongly. There are letters from him in the archives of pushing to have the department shut down. Do you see Masonic notions of freedom influencing John and the Truman administration and shutting down the Department of Censorship?
Well, it's quite interesting. I can never say for a fact whether being a Freemason and of course Truman being not only a Freemason, a leader of Freemasonry and so active in Freemasonry in and of itself, guaranteed John the position. There's one thing very important, and Truman himself really insisted on that. In the teachings of Freemasonry as a society, meritocracy is very important. If we are to free ourselves from what the old order established as the way for people to move ahead, and what was the old order? What's your family? Where you come from? What tribe? What clan? What is your religion? These things will automatically give you the position to enable you to advance. And if you're not in that classification, forget it. The whole idea, the premise, the great experiment, the teachings of Freemasonry, you advance based on merit. It's not because of who's your dad, or what religion you belong to, or what social economic class. You make yourself. That is freedom from the past. Okay, and it is reinforced every time a Masonic lodge opens and closes. Every time in every Masonic meeting, this concept is reinforced. You get paid when you are due wages. You advance based on merit. Meritocracy is at the heart of the American experiment. We've never fully lived up to it. We know from our history, but we always strive to go for it. This is important. So I would say John Fetzer proved himself. He showed he had the merit. His past experience showed it. Now, the fact that he was a Mason, and again, that ear did help, yes, but in and of itself is not. It's not about favoritism. The idea is, especially for someone like Truman, Truman took these things very seriously. He was probably the most engaged modern president. And I mean engaged, hands-on. He attended, even when he was president, Masonic meetings, okay? Again, in modern history, there's no one like Truman, and he really insisted on those principles. And this idea of freedom definitely rang true with him. So yes, if John was proud of that, I can see why. Because yes, as I told you, it's a matter of balancing. How do we protect? How do we defend this safe haven, which is America? It's a safe haven. Without it, if it's not safe, we're not going to be able to advance the cause of enlightened freedom and help the human condition move forward. The next phase is important. But at the same time, how do we defend it without undermining the foundational basis of that enlightened freedom is very important. So at that time, they saw the way that we did it, they closed it, perfect. It ran true. Yes, of course, it resonated with the concept of enlightened freedom. Now in this country and the world, we're facing this renewed challenge, but more amplified.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
I have to ask this simply because you brought it up. Is there a connection between Freemasonry and Truman and the rise in the national security state?
The rise of the national security state, rise of institutions. Well, let me say something. Obviously, it made sense to attract people who know how to keep silent, who understood the importance of silence in general. Silence in Masonry is thought for, again, internal meditation, for creating respect, so you listen to others, and then create better harmonious bonds within the community. So if you take that now and you want to create a national security concept, that is how to really protect and face this invasive extremist ideology that is on the assault against freedom and the safe haven of freedom, which is the United States of America, you need people you can trust. It's the same way that George Washington relied on people he could trust to fight the War of Independence. You're facing, the most powerful empire at the time, that at least for Americans, we learned, is Great Britain. And that explains to you why Benjamin Franklin recruited while he was in Europe, Masons to help train the American militia. It's people you can trust, would, if they're committed. First, there's the belief, the same values, and then you could trust that they could keep quiet. So, yeah, it makes sense. But I don't want to give you the impression here, a false impression, that Freemasonry or Freemasons created the whole apparatus. No, but it made sense that you could have some people involved in establishing some of these institutions.
Well, also that Truman was comfortable with that, comfortable with secrecy.
So. Very much so. He understood what the importance of that. There's no question about it. And I think the challenge today is even greater because we live in such an open world, and people expect a much greater degree of openness, and that openness is very important, must be preserved, must be pursued, but at the same time, how do you check and balance? Check and balance. Because it's the same way technology can be used for destructive as well as constructive purposes. Openness can be used for destructive as well as constructive purposes. It's all about that balance, harmony, equilibrium, and that's where that community of freedom is very important. And don't control it. Okay?
Well, thank you, Akram.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
Unless you have any more, Brian, that ends this topic.
Yeah,
thank you.
Cool, my pleasure.